So thanks again to have joined the call. As just agree, I'm started the recording, so the call will be recorded, and I will share the recording later. And I hope that will be also useful to other institutions to know more about DSpace-CRIS and OpenAIRE integration. In the call, we have all the institutions that are participating in the pilot phase of the implementation. So we have the Technical University of Hamburg, the Cyprus University of Technology, and the University of Trieste. And I'm also very happy to have in the call Andreas, that is from the OpenAIRE team, and can help to give more detail, more insight about the technical aspect of the OpenAIRE infrastructure and the validation, and is on the call, and we can ask him about further detail. So please stop me at any time. The idea of the call is just to give you as much detail as possible about the current state of the implementation and the next phase. I'm going to share a presentation, and also the slide will be available later. So the topic of the call today is the implementation of the OpenAIRE CRIS RIF guideline in DSpace-CRIS. This is a funded project for science, was awarded by OpenAIRE Advanced, the current OpenAIRE project, to implement the OpenAIRE CRIS guideline in DSpace-CRIS, because as you know, DSpace-CRIS is widely adopted over the world, and specifically also in Europe. So the idea, the goal is to allow DSpace-CRIS to expose out of box the richer information that institutions collect using DSpace-CRIS to the OpenAIRE infrastructure. And this will be done according to the serif standard, that is the format that has been selected by OpenAIRE to harvest CRIS system. On this slide, I give a bit more context about which is the current integration that DSpace-CRIS provide for OpenAIRE. In DSpace-CRIS, you have the guideline literature repository version 3, the data archive repository version 2, and now we are implementing the CRIS guideline version 1.1.1, that is the latest version of the CRIS guideline. DSpace-CRIS also have support the project API from OpenAIRE, so that you can use the OpenAIRE project database to look up for project information during the submission process. DSpace-CRIS implement the same posting protocol that is not yet adopted, as far as I know, by the OpenAIRE infrastructure, but is envisioned as a suitable mechanism to improve the full text discoverability. Same posting is one of the protocols that is recommended by the next generation repository of CORE. And also we have integration out-of-box support for the OpenAIRE statistics. So OpenAIRE provide a statistics, usage statistics service to collect in a normalized, in a standard way, statistics from repository, and they have provided plugin to integrate this service in DSpace. And what we have done for DSpace-CRIS is to integrate this plugin out of box in DSpace-CRIS so that no additional installation is required. And of course, we have also solved and managed some compatibility issues specific of DSpace-CRIS. So the task that was included in this implementation are essentially three. The most important, one of the first thing that we have need to do to support the CRIS guidelines is to generalize the DSpace-CRIS oai-pmh server to disseminate also additional entity other than the space items. So in a basic DSpace, you only expose publication over oai-pmh. Now with DSpace-CRIS, you are also able to expose your richer contextual information. So you expose your person, your organization, your project, and so on. The second important point was to give the ability to the single institution to adapt a data model to their needs. So OpenAIRE and the guideline have selected a subset of the serif entity that are the more representative for the information useful in the OpenAIRE context. But of course, also this subset in some case could be too much for some institution that don't have the organization capability or don't want to put the effort to maintain this information, or simply they cannot share this information. So I'm talking about person record, organization, project, equipment, events, and so on. So it's not required. We don't expect that all the institution will manage all this entity at the same level and want to share the same all this entity. So you will be able to decide how your data model will map to the OpenAIRE CRIS data model. But also we want to help institutions to start from, to have a very good start. So the default installation of the DSpace-CRIS will be very close to the data model selected by OpenAIRE. So that if you are fine with just the default, you will end with a default mapping that will work for the OpenAIRE information space, and all the entity, all the information that OpenAIRE is able to collect from you will be available in your CRIS, DSpace-CRIS installation. You will be able to input such information. So I will go over some detail about the change that we have made. First, we'll talk about improvements to the OI index. In the DSpace-CRIS now, all the objects are included into OI core. So as you probably know, in DSpace, and so DSpace-CRIS use Solar as backend for the oai-pmh server, and have a dedicated Solar core that is named OI to where the information exposed over oai-pmh are stored. So now with OpenAIRE compliancy, DSpace-CRIS also put in this core information about your CRIS entity, so the person, organization, and so on. All the default contexts are untouched, so you don't need to worry about existent use of the oai-pmh server. Your base context for oai-pmh will be untouched, and all the publication will be exposed over this endpoint. And also, if you have created custom endpoint, you can simply add a filter to your endpoint to exclude the CRIS where they are not appropriated. We have also changed the process of indexing TOI. So in the basic DSpace installation, what need to be indexed is retrieved using a SQL query. So essentially, the indexing script will query the database to decide what need to be included in TOI core and what is changed to and need to be updated. Now we do that using the search index. So instead to make a database query, we make a Solar query. This gives you more flexibility, and you will be also able eventually to exclude something from OI just using a Solar query. and these also have some performance benefit. The last point is really important, and especially in the context of the CRIS guideline. When you are using DSpace-CRIS, you have a rich graph of entities that are interconnected. So when you look to a publication, you have some metadata into publication, but you also know that this publication has been authored by a person, and you know some information about this person. You know the ORCID ID, you know other identifier, maybe you know the gender and the affiliation and so on. In the CRIS guideline, you have the possibility to expose also this rich set of information. So you are not limited to flat or the information at the publication level, but you can expose your graph. And to do that, of course, we have extended the indexing process so that the graph of objects are also stored into OI core. So as anticipated, we also have improved the default data model of the DSpace-CRIS. In the default data model, now we have included the configuration for 3 research output collection. So instead to only deal with publication, you have now a default configuration also to deal with patents and product. Product is the serif name essentially to talk about dataset. We have also improved the data model for project and funding, for person, organization unit, events, and equipment and journal. So equipment is a completely new entity that was not present in the previous version of the data model of the DSpace-CRIS. But also the other entity have some additional attributes that are relevant in the context of OpenAIRE and can be useful to be collected. And we have also improved the default configuration to enable out-of-box the creation of research entity as part of the submission. So this means that when you are describing a publication and you select a new project, this project will create a project entity in your DSpace-CRIS system. The OpenAIRE integration with the project API is enabled out of box now. And also the compliance with the OpenAIRE guideline is enabled without you do anything special. So the default mapping is provided out of box and is enabled. This again is an effort to make sure that the new installation of the DSpace-CRIS will be automatically compliant with OpenAIRE and will collect rich information and can provide this rich information back to OpenAIRE. So the project phases was, in our idea, was essentially 3. So we are now presenting the result of the implementation phase, of the initial implementation phase, where we have had support for CRIS objects in version 5. We have extended the default data model of the DSpace-CRIS, and we have provided a default mapping. During this implementation phase, we have also provided a lot of feedback to the guidelines that we think that will produce a new version of the guideline that could be a 1.1.2, a minor improvement, or maybe a 1.2 as also some change in the XSD are proposed. Now we want to start the pilot phase. The goal of the pilot phase is to work with you and improve the documentation. So check the existing documentation if it's enough, what detail should be added, what need to be fixed. We want to learn from running this code on a real installation. So we want to double check that our mapping mechanism will work on real data with data model that are not exactly our default proposal. And of course, we work with you to identify and fix any bug that could arise. After this phase, we will port a solution also to version 6 and to version 7. So we want to have this implementation of the guideline included also in DSpace-CRIS 7, the version that we are developing. And all the code will be merged in the official branch and enabled by default in a new installation of DSpace-CRIS. Right now, the implementation is available on a side branch on GitHub. So you can check the source code yourself. You have here in the slide a link to the branch on GitHub again. The documentation has been started on the official wiki space. So there is a page for describing the OpenAIRE integration, all the aspects of the OpenAIRE integration, not only the guideline for CRIS Manager. We are updating to DSpace-CRIS official demo, and right now we have a new demo that is dedicated to this project. So is based on the OpenAIRE CRIS branch. It's really similar to the URL of the official demo of DSpace-CRIS, as maybe you recognize, but it's just different the final domain. So it's DSpace-CRIS for science.cloud instead than .it. That is the official demo of DSpace-CRIS. And on this demo, of course, is enabled. We have enabled OpenAIRE CRIS endpoint. During the pilot phase, we ask you to report any bug and provide feedback about DSpace-CRIS implementation, of course, on GitHub. If possible on GitHub. This is because we want to have public information about the pilot phase. So as you are also customer of For Science, if you don't need to talk about specific requirement of your institution or anything that is sensitive, please open a ticket on GitHub instead and use our customer portal. If you have specific feedback about the guideline, you can use this Google Doc that is maintained by Andreas and the OpenAIRE staff, also to improve the CRIS guideline, directly the CRIS guideline. So again, the goal for the pilot phase is to improve the documentation, validate implementation on real installation and data, and fix any bug that could be identified. As said at the start of the meeting, your three institutions are involved in this pilot phase, but we are absolutely open to provide feedback on the community if other institutions will start to play with the code and need support or provide feedback. So the Technical University of Hamburg cleanly has set to work on their institutional repository, on their CRIS system. And the University of Trieste will make experiment with two different installations. One is OpenStart, that is the institutional repository of of the university that also collects some additional information about the person and events, and something that make this institutional repository more close to a CRIS system. The second installation instead is a regional installation for the Italian region of Friuli Venezia Giulia, and harvest data from university in the region from the CRIS system of the university in the region. So they have information about publication, product, person, project, and organization unit. Last but not least, the CRIS University of Technology have a very comprehensive CRIS system in production where you collect a lot of information about your staff, organization, project, publication, and all the connection among this entity. So, which will be the next step in our idea? We will work with each of you to merge the OpenAIRE feature in your installation source code. We can revisit the data model, if you like, together. So look into what we have changed into the default data model of DSpace-CRIS. This could be also an opportunity to rethink about your data model, to move some content from one property to another, or to collect more information. We will configure the mapping for your specific data model. And at the end, we will ask you to register your CRIS system on the OpenAIRE validation. And maybe on that, I can ask Andreas to give more detail.
Thank you, Andrea, for the good and detailed introduction. And we are happy that you have won the implementation for the new OpenAIRE CRIS guidelines. So for the registration and validation on the OpenAIRE side, we are actually improve our registration workflow and also the validation workflow. So you have the chance to validate your DSpace-CRIS system on the OpenAIRE website, but also there exists another implementation for the OpenAIRE CRIS guidelines separately on GitHub. That can you also use to validate your real life data against the CRIS guidelines of OpenAIRE at the actual version. So yeah, I'm happy that you all agree to help us and for science. It's the company that implement our CRIS guidelines. And I look forward to work with you on these pilot phase, and hope that we have a good discussion to make the implementation the best of OpenAIRE guidelines with the DSpace-CRIS. So yeah, that's, if you need any help in the registration phase or validation phase of at the OpenAIRE portal, so please contact me or the OpenAIRE help desk, that we can support you on this side. And at the moment, we have 8 CRIS systems in our beta environment system, and this is not also DSpace-CRIS systems that are pure systems at the moment. There are also an aggregator that are provide us via the CRIS guideline or CRIS guidelines the data, and yeah, I hope that we can integrate you also in the beta environment of OpenAIRE. Thank you.
Thanks, Andreas. So I want to open the room to question. I also prepared to show you some examples from the live demo. So if you want to see something more concrete before you ask question, also feel free to wait. I will share again the screen, hopefully the right one this time. Can you please confirm you see the DSpace demo, DSpace-CRIS demo, right?
DSpace is live.
Okay, perfect, thank you. So here we have just created a couple of entities. There is no much information, and the data come from the example provided in the CRIS guidelines. So for instance, here you have one publication, and you see that there are much more bibliographic detail about the publication. So you have start date and date, volume, issue. This is to show that all the metadata included into the guideline are exposed. And also you have relations. So in this case, this publication is connected to 4 authors and is connected to a project. So you can go to navigate this relation and, for instance, look to the record of this author that is a bit more richer than other because also have an affiliation to an organization unit with a start date. They have a lot of identifier. So what this means in terms of Oai-pmh? On this tab, you will see the identify verb of the Oai-pmh. So I open here the raw XML response. So in this case, you see that the peculiarity of the CRIS guideline is to include an additional description in your identifier response that give detail about which version of the guideline you implement, and also provide a link to your base URL and the public URL of the installation. If you look at the set that are exposed over Oai-pmh, you will find a lot of sets that are defined in the specification. And these sets are in addition to the default set that DSpace and DSpace-CRIS are always provide that are the community and collection. So in the OpenAIRE guideline for CRIS system, you have a separate set for each kind of entity. So you have a set for product, for organization unit, for patents, for person, events, equipment, and so on. Here I show you the response for one specific set. The metadata prefix used here is the OI serif OpenAIRE. That is the serif format. And here you see the publication that I showed you before on the public website. So you have all the metadata about this publication, you have the volume number, the issue, the start date, the end date, the DOI, and so on. But more important, you have some connection, so some embedded entity. In this case, this is a journal. So as this publication was a journal article and reference a journal, inside this tag, you see that there is a link to the publication that is of type journal. So this is the core vocabulary, the core resource type vocabulary, and this specific URI is associated with the term of journals. You have the title of the journal here and one identifier for the journal, that is the ISSN. At the same point, you also have reference to author. So in this case, this publication has been authored by this person. And it's important to note that for each author, you have a display name and a person tag. So the display name is how this author was referenced in the publication. So which signature this author have used for the specific publication. It could be a Chinese name, it could be an Occidental name, it could be abbreviated, or it could be full. It's really representative bibliographic data. The person embedded here instead is the representation of the linked entity. So in this record, you will get the identifier of the person, you will get the first name, family name, split in separate field, and eventually additional information that you have at this, about these persons, such as an ORCID or a Scopus ID, and so on. DSpace-CRIS allow you to maintain both internal author and external. So you are not required to have a CRIS researcher profile for each author. If you have a researcher profile in the oai-pmh record, you will get both the display name and the person record. If you don't have any detail about the person because it's an external person, you will have only the display name. And the same apply also for the other embedded entities. So if you don't know detail about the journal because you don't maintain an authority of the journal, you will not have an identifier for the journal. You will only include the information that you have collected. But if you put an ID here, this means that you have a specific record also for this entity. You can see also that there is an originated from. In this case, this is the relation to the project. So also in this case, you are able to use a display name to put exactly the acknowledged string that was used in the publication and embed the project with all the detail that you have about this project, including the team, so the principal investigator, with the reference to the person, and the funder, so the European Commission that has funded the project, and funding information about how many, the amount of the grant, the currency, and the fact that this grant was part of a funding program that was the FP7. As you can see here, for instance, we decided that is common for an institution to don't have an authority for external organization for the funder. So in this case, we just say that this project was funded by the European Commission, but honestly, the institution typically don't have a rich record about the European Commission organization or other external organization. And as you don't have a local record, there is no organization unit embedded here. Also, the case of the principal investigator here was done to show you the support for security in this implementation. So only the entity that you flag as public will be exposed over oai-pmh. If you have a project that is private or a person that have a private profile, you will only expose the public name, because this is also shown on the DSpace-CRIS user interface. When you describe the project, you can link a lot of profile, but if these profiles are not public, you only get the full name, the string of the person that is involved in the project, but you don't get any detail about this person. You don't get the contact information and so on. On this other tab, instead, I show you an example of patent. So you see here the mapping about the registration agency, so the European Patent Office in this case, with a record for the organization unit. You get a record for the inventor, the different person, and also a record for the holder. So in this case, it's an organization unit. And you can link a patent with a previous patent. So in this case, you have a reference to your predecessor that is also stored in the repository with all the detail about this previous patent. Here, an example of equipment. So, sorry, this is an example of dataset, sorry. In this case, you have the dataset that was originated in a specific project. So you have the reference to the project. And again, this project have information about who have funded the project and about the funding. So you have the grant with the program. And you also have information about the equipment that was used to generate this product. So you can link a specific data set to an equipment record, and if you have accurate information about your equipment, such as an additional description or other identifier, or the location of this equipment, the owner of the equipment, if it is an organization or a specific person, you can also expose this information. Here is an example about a specific person. So in this case, this is the richer record that we see in the user interface. So it was about Nikos sauces. Here you see that he has an ORCID, a researcher ID, a Scopus author ID. You also know about the affiliation with a start date in this case, but you also could have an end date and so on. And a reference to an organization that is a department inside a larger organization. The last example is just a detail about the project. So we have already explored it, starting from the publication that referenced this project. So this is all what I want to show you today. I really like to receive questions from you, both at the technical from the technical perspective, then from the organization perspective. So just ask everything that you need to know about this implementation.
I have a question. Do I understand it correctly that the funding information is always bound to a project? I mean, it's impossible that way to show sponsoring information from companies to fund one specific publication, for instance. I don't need a project for that. I just need the company who funded the publication. Is this possible, or does OpenAIRE do not need that at all?
It's possible. So the OpenAIRE guideline allow you to link a publication directly with the funding. So you are not required to link a publication to a project, but you can also link a publication directly to a funding. And you can also expose just funding information alone, also if they are not embedded, are not linked to a project. In the default data model that we have implemented, we decide to apply a simplification. And in our data model, the project and the funding are flattened in a single entity, so that you have funding information at the level of the project. But you can also use two different entities and map both entity to the OpenAIRE specification. So this is something that can be done. The reason why we decide to don't include it in the default implementation is because it makes things much more complex for also for the user, for the end user. What we have seen so far is an user typically talk about project and funding as they was just a single thing. They don't really understand the difference between a funding and a project. You could have a project that have received multiple funding in some case, but is not really something that many institutions track or are able to track. And in some case, you are also forced by the funder to create multiple projects if you have different funding. Because in the SAFE data model, the consortium, so which organization are involved, are stored only at the level of project, are not stored at the level of the funding. So if you have two funding for the same project, it's usually you have different consortium. So maybe you have an international consortium that get a funding from the European Commission, and a national, only your institution that get additional funding from a national program or something like that. This is also one of the issue that we raise again for the current guideline. So we have proposed to extend the guideline to allow you to specify at the funding level which organization really get the money, so that if you have one project that have funding from the European Commission and funding from the national project, you can make really clear on your data that the amount, the funding that you are talking about is just the funding that apply to your organization and not to the whole project.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And another question, Andreas mentioned a validation tool for the output to OpenAIRE, which is available on OpenAIRE, but also on GitHub. Which one should we use to validate the results of your implementation? Do we need to install something locally, or can we use the online validation tool on OpenAIRE?
So at the moment, we improve the workflows on the beta environment of OpenAIRE to that you can use the workflows of the validation in this environment, in this beta environment, that is not in productive at the moment. So we work on this, and you can choose it for testing. But if you need an external review on this, you can also write me an email that I can validate this separately from the workflows of the content provider dashboard that Andrea shown. Or so you need no set up locally. If you want, you can do this because the validator of the CRIS guidelines is on GitHub. I paste the link into the chat. One moment. So. This is your decision, so.
We can use the online implementation, which is displayed by Andrea at the moment.
Yes, what I say is this is under construction at the moment, so you can use it, and you can also write me an email for this. Okay.
Yeah, we can also help you on this process, Oliver. In general, or your institution. So my idea is then we will work together to create a test environment for you with the OpenAIRE guideline implementation in place for your repository. And we can mediate between you and Andreas. We can to register onto beta content, provide dashboard your base URL, and run some validation. What will be required on your side is to discuss with us the mapping. So which information do you want to provide to OpenAIRE? What is different in your data model compared to our default proposal for DSpace-CRIS?
Sure.
And also, I will appreciate if you can just look to the default implementation proposal and also to the technical documentation and just provide feedback about that. If anything is not completely clear, we would like to improve it for the community. So I don't expect that you need to manage the source code yourself, because again, the merge of this feature with your repository will be done by For Science. This is both for the Technical University of Hamburg, then for the University of Technology of Cyprus, and for University of Trieste. But as all of you are technicians, and if you can provide feedback about implementation and documentation, it will be really appreciated.
Thank you.
One question also here from Trieste to Andreas. Now I was managing on the beta provide OpenAIRE searching for my repository. It's already registered, and I see that we could test when For Science will give us the endpoint. And one curiosity. Let's say that the new guidelines for CRIS has all the data that for publication of data sets, and from the OpenAIRE point of view, is it's at the end in production. It's a good thing to validate our repository, yes, on this CRIS system, but also on the side of literature repository guidelines and on the side of data archives, or concentrate only on the CRIS side?
There's a good question. So thank you.
We could test on all three guidelines. Let me say, on this side, we are now concentrating to test and give feedback on the CRIS system. But it's nice to have also the repository compliant to all the other. What are
So if you, one question, which literature guidelines do you refer to?
To the free. Version 3, yes. As Andrea said, the CRIS now is, DSpace-CRIS is compliant to version 3, I think, yes.
Yes, there are some implementation at the moment for OpenAIRE literature guidelines or institutional and thematic guidelines version 4. Call it literature guidelines version 4. If you are also at the moment registered in the beta system environment of OpenAIRE, we can add more endpoints to your repository and can harvesting from any of your endpoints your files differently, or if it literature or data or CRIS. You have it seems to catch all repository that you have, and at the moment I think that we highlight the CRIS implementation of the guidelines on your side. So the literature guidelines are updated to version 4. The data guidelines would also updated, I think, at the end of this year or beginning of the next year. So let us take a look closely on the CRIS guidelines. That is mostly completed and updated on the vocabulary and so on. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So trying to summarize this discussion, because I think that is really interesting. From the perspective of for science as implementer of DSpace-CRIS, I think that it is important to provide a wider range of support for different guidelines, because maybe other than OpenAIRE, other projects could reuse the OpenAIRE guideline for specific purpose. So it's important that your repository, also if the CRIS guideline provides a richer set of information, should also implement the literature repository guideline or the data archive repository guideline to participate in specific initiatives. From the side of OpenAIRE, what I think that is important to do during this pilot phase is also to confirm that CRIS guideline bring to OpenAIRE all the information that OpenAIRE needs. And your repository can really switch to the CRIS guideline to provide a wider range of information, and you don't lose any detail in this switch. I think that this is something that all of us should check and look during this pilot phase.
Yes, thank you. It's clear.
Any other question from you?
Yes, Andrea. Now we could start with this test pilot. And if I understand as the fourth, and we could also decide to filter some entities that we defined in our repository that are not standard, like you know, we defined some news, let me say, entities that has no importance to be exposed in this case.
Yes, of course, any custom information that you have in your repository will be not exposed by default. So you don't need to worry about the news. They will be not exposed because there is not a mapping for this entity in the OpenAIRE guideline. What we should look is if you have any custom entity or custom attribute that can be exposed. Because maybe you have defined the start page, end page in the publication in a different metadata than what we have defined in the new default configuration. Because in the previous version, DSpace-CRIS don't collect this detail, and maybe some of your institution have added this metadata to collect this information. This applies to both to any entity, so it could be about a publication or a person or an organization and so on. And also the example that Oliver have as proposed. So if you collect funding information in a different way, we should work on how to expose this information to OpenAIRE.
Thank you. Clear. So when we start?
Yeah, we will start is Friday, so we will start on Monday. And we will start discussing with each of you where to work on that. So if you have the test environment where you will run the code or any specific needs that you have, this will be done through the customer portal. But again, if you hit any issue with the documentation or with the source code that don't contain any sensitive data from your institution, please open the ticket on GitHub, so that all the institution will see the progress of the other institution in the pilot and can participate, can join the conversation. Of course, the pilot is free of charge for the institution, so is covered by the funding provided by OpenAIRE, and this regardless if you use the GitHub issue or the customer portal to report any needs.
Fine, thank you.
Okay, so thanks to all of you to have attended this meeting, and thanks again, Andreas, also to have joined and provided the point of view of the OpenAIRE team on that. We will be in touch, and I'm sure that it will be an important work that we can contribute to the community.
Yes, thank you, Andrea, for this nice introduction and state-of-the-art implementation information. So, yes, I hope we have I look forward to a good discussion with you and good implementation. on this side, and please, if you have any questions on the OpenAIRE guidelines or anything else, you can also contact me or the guidelines teams for this. Thank you all.
Okay, bye. Have a nice weekend to all.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.